In my whole career, I've never seen anything like this.
The room was prepared for ceremony, not betrayal. Prince George had been expected to sit quietly beside the senior royals, observe protocol, and say almost nothing. Instead, he rose with a private letter in his hand and changed the atmosphere in seconds. Meghan's name was written across the correspondence, but the most devastating part was not who had sent it. It was what George believed the letter revealed about his family, and why he chose that exact moment to expose it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. George had been invited to the fictional Windsor gathering because William had increasingly allowed his eldest son to observe moments connected to his future responsibilities. Prince George was still a child, but protocol, the established rules governing royal conduct and formal occasions, was already becoming part of his education. Charles, Camilla, Catherine, and Princess Anne were present, alongside selected household figures, each expecting a controlled family discussion. William believed observation would teach his son restraint. None of them expected George to become the person who shattered it. Meghan remained physically distant from the royal court, yet private family communication had never completely disappeared. Her letter had not arrived through an official palace channel. Instead, it had passed through a fictional chain of personal correspondence before reaching George, making the message intimate rather than institutional. Meghan's words suggested that he should question whether William and Catherine had ever told him the complete truth about the Sussex rupture, the family breakdown that separated Harry and Meghan from their former senior royal roles. George suddenly placed the folded letter on the table. The young prince said, "Everyone present deserved to hear what had been written to him," then began reading aloud. William stiffened almost immediately. The prince wanted to stop his son before an adult conflict swallowed him completely. Yet George had already carried the burden alone long enough to decide confrontation was safer than silence. Catherine barely looked at the paper. She watched George instead. The princess understood that the real danger was not simply Meghan's wording. It was the possibility that her son had spent days questioning his parents without telling them. George continued, his voice controlled until he reached the middle of the letter. Then he stopped. George told them there was another passage. This one mentioned Charlotte and Louis directly. William looked at his son, understood there was no turning back, and quietly told him to continue. Charles changed the moment he heard the final section approaching. The king realized Meghan's letter was no longer circling old grievances. It was challenging something more dangerous, the story the next generation had been taught about loyalty, family, and the crown. And before anyone could decide whether George had exposed Meghan, protected his siblings, or crossed an irreversible line, one question overtook the room. Why had this letter been written to him at all? George had inherited a future before he was old enough to understand what inheritance truly costs. Now, with Meghan's words still hanging over the room, that future suddenly felt personal. William saw a son who had been pulled into a conflict he had spent years trying to contain. Catherine saw something more painful, a boy who believed silence might make him complicit. And across the table, Charles recognized the same royal dilemma that had haunted his own family for generations. George's position made everything heavier. Prince George was not simply William and Catherine's eldest son, he was also the child expected one day to inherit the crown, meaning the constitutional role and public responsibility of the sovereign. That future placed adult expectations around him long before adulthood itself. Harry and Meghan existed in that emotional landscape as distant relatives, whose departure and public disputes had become part of the family history surrounding his childhood. George had grown up hearing enough to know there was a wound, but never enough to understand exactly where it began. William waited until the reading paused before asking the question he had been holding back. The prince wanted to know why George had not brought the letter to him privately. His son answered with painful simplicity. Every private conversation about Harry and Meghan seemed to disappear behind closed doors. George said he did not want this one to vanish too. William heard the accusation beneath the words, even if his son had not intended it as one. Catherine felt that wound immediately. The princess reached across the table and closed her hand over George's trembling fingers. She told him that protecting children from adult conflict was not the same as lying to them. George did not pull away, but he did not release the letter either. He admitted that he no longer understood where protection ended and secrecy began. Catherine had no easy answer, and her silence told him that she knew it. George then revealed something none of them expected. Meghan's letter had not arrived without context. It referred to an earlier message and suggested that someone inside the extended royal circle had told her he had begun asking questions about Harry. William's expression hardened. The prince suddenly remembered a family gathering weeks earlier when George had asked, almost casually, why his uncle no longer came to certain occasions. Anne remembered it too. Princess Anne had been present that afternoon, and she remembered exactly who else had heard the question. More importantly, she remembered who had left the conversation almost immediately afterward. Catherine still held George's hand when Anne finally spoke. The family had been treating that afternoon as meaningless. Now it looked like the moment everything had begun. The disaster did not begin with a letter. It began with a question. Weeks earlier, during a fictional private lunch at Sandringham, George had heard Harry's name mentioned, and asked something so simple that several adults immediately stopped speaking. Why, he wanted to know, could a family appear together before the world yet remain unable to sit around the same table privately? Nobody gave him a complete answer. That silence became the opening through which everything else entered. George had become more curious about the history he would one day inherit. Prince George was beginning to understand that succession, the order determining who eventually inherits the crown, came with more than ceremonies and public duties. It also meant inheriting unresolved family tensions. Charles, Camilla, William, Catherine, Anne, and Charlotte were all present at the Sandringham lunch, which was personal rather than ceremonial. That made what followed even harder, because there was no public audience to blame for the tension. George turned directly to William and asked, "If Uncle Harry is still family, why does everyone act afraid to talk about him?" The prince did not answer immediately. William finally told his son that loving someone and trusting their decisions were not always the same thing. George heard the care in his father's words, but he also heard what was missing. Years of pain had been compressed into one cautious sentence. Charles tried to soften the silence. The king said some family wounds required time, but before speaking, he glanced toward William. George noticed. That small hesitation convinced him there was another version of the story, one the younger generation had never been allowed to hear. Catherine watched her son process the moment and knew the explanation had not reassured him. Anne noticed something else. Princess Anne saw that George was no longer asking out of simple curiosity. He wanted clarity. After lunch, while the others began leaving, she paused near the doorway and found him still sitting beside the extinguished fireplace. The young prince looked less angry than unsettled. Anne realized the question had not disappeared simply because the adults had stopped answering it. Someone carried that question beyond Sandringham. George's exact frustration that nobody would speak plainly about Harry eventually reached Meghan. Her private letter was written as an attempt to give him what she considered her side of the history. But several passages went further than explanation. One line changed everything. Meghan told George there might come a day when he would have to choose between protecting the institution and protecting the truth. William read those words and felt his restraint collapse. The prince no longer saw a family explanation. He saw an adult placing a moral burden onto his son. Now that sentence sat in George's hands, and William was finally ready to confront the person he believed had put it there. William had remained silent while George read. That restraint ended the moment the letter suggested his children might someday discover that their parents had protected the monarchy at their expense. The prince pushed his chair back and stood. There was no shouting at first. That made the moment heavier. He looked at George, then at Charles, and finally at Meghan's words on the table. When he spoke, the fury came from somewhere deeper than royal protocol. William drew the boundary with frightening clarity. The prince could endure arguments between adults, interviews, accusations, and years of private resentment. But involving George, Charlotte, or Louis was different. Royal protocol meant the established rules governing how members of the monarchy behave and handle sensitive matters, yet even those rules felt secondary now. His children were not bargaining pieces. Charles understood that immediately and tried to steady the room, especially because several household figures had never witnessed such an intimate family rupture. George did not retreat. Prince George looked directly at his father and asked the question William least wanted to hear. "Would you have shown me this letter if it had come to you first?" The future king opened his mouth, then stopped. That hesitation landed harder than any denial. George saw confirmation in it. Adults were preparing him for a lifetime of responsibility while still deciding which truths he was allowed to carry. William finally answered. The prince admitted he probably would not have shown George the entire letter. Not because he feared Meghan's version of events, he said, but because he refused to let his son become a messenger between two wounded branches of the family. George heard the explanation, but the pain remained. He was being told he must one day carry the crown, yet he could not carry the full history surrounding it. George unfolded the remaining page. He read the passage he had withheld, where Meghan argued that Charlotte and Louis would eventually ask why the family fractured and should not be handed what she called a palace-approved version. William placed both palms on the table. His voice dropped. "You are my son before you are anyone's future king." George answered without looking away. "Then let me be your son, and tell me the truth." Catherine moved before the room could fracture further. The princess did not demand the letter be taken away or destroyed. Instead, she said everyone should hear the final page. William turned toward her, stunned by the choice. Catherine held his gaze and made it clear that stopping now would only prove George's fear correct. Charles understood what that meant. The king was no longer deciding whether the letter was appropriate. He was deciding whether he still had the authority to stop the family from hearing it. And once Catherine kept the letter on the table, the confrontation changed completely. For decades, royal crises had been managed through hierarchy. The sovereign decided, advisors contained, and everyone else followed. But this crisis had arrived in the hands of a child who would one day inherit that hierarchy himself. Charles could end the gathering. He could order the correspondence removed. He could insist that George leave. Yet every option carried a cost, because forcing silence now might confirm the very accusation inside Meghan's letter that the institution always closed ranks when family truth became uncomfortable. Charles understood that his authority had limits no crown could erase. The king was the fictional head of the royal household, meaning he carried final institutional responsibility for how the family operated in official settings. But William and Catherine remained George's parents. That distinction mattered. The monarch could control the meeting, yet he could not simply replace their judgment as mother and father. Anne saw the danger immediately and quietly warned him that using royal rank to dominate a family argument would only deepen the wound. Charles felt trapped. The king wanted to protect George from being used as a messenger, but he also knew Harry and Meghan were not present to defend their own perspective. William had no patience for that balance. The prince told his father that neutrality became impossible the moment children were drawn into an adult feud. Charles pushed back. Anger, he warned, could not become permission to erase another branch of the family simply because their words were painful. George opened the final page. Prince George expected another accusation. Instead, Meghan's letter offered something quieter and more unsettling. History is usually written by whoever remained inside the palace. The line stopped Charles cold. The monarch heard more than criticism in it. He heard echoes of older royal generations, families in which children had inherited softened versions of their parents' failures because adults believed silence would protect them. Charles suddenly understood why George would not surrender the letter. The king could disagree with Meghan's choice to write it, and still recognize the fear underneath his grandson's refusal. George did not want gossip. He wanted proof that difficult history would not simply be hidden from him until someone else told it first. Charles removed his glasses and folded them carefully. "No more messages through paper," he said. "If George has questions, we answer them ourselves." William looked toward his father, surprised. Catherine remained beside their son. Anne said nothing, because the decision already carried enough weight. The letter would not be confiscated. George could keep it. But that freedom came with a consequence nobody in the room had fully considered. If the family was finally going to answer him directly, then George could ask everything. And the first question he chose was the one they feared most. By evening, the shock of George's reading had been replaced by something colder. Nobody could pretend the conflict belonged only to Harry, Meghan, William, and Catherine anymore. Charlotte had learned that her name appeared in the letter. Charles had been forced to revisit choices he had spent years compartmentalizing. And William faced the realization that protecting his children from family history had created a vacuum one somebody else had stepped forward to fill. The household separated almost immediately after the gathering. Advisors were told not to brief the press, meaning palace staff were specifically instructed not to provide journalists with private information or background guidance. Catherine's attention moved away from the adults and toward Charlotte and Louis. She was determined that neither child would hear a distorted version of the crisis through servants, acquaintances, or fragments of public chatter. The princess understood that once children sensed secrecy, silence could become more frightening than the truth itself. Charlotte asked the question Catherine had been dreading. Princess Charlotte wanted to know why Meghan had mentioned her at all. Her mother struggled before answering that adults sometimes speak through children when they no longer know how to speak directly to one another. Charlotte listened carefully, then asked whether she had done something wrong. Catherine answered immediately, "No, the child had done nothing. The failure belonged to the adults." William faced a different wound. The prince sat alone with George and admitted that his instinct had always been to shield him from the ugliest parts of the family conflict. George answered that shielding could feel exactly like exclusion when everyone else seemed to know the story. His father did not argue. For the first time, William understood that protection without explanation could leave a child feeling less safe, not more. George then corrected the assumption everyone had made. Prince George said he had not read the letter aloud because he hated Meghan or wanted to expose her. He had done it because being asked to carry the message secretly made him feel manipulated. He refused to become a confidential intermediary, someone used to pass sensitive information between people who would not speak directly. William's anger shifted immediately. The future king realized his son had not chosen the Sussex side or the Wales side. George had rejected both sides' expectation that he should quietly carry an adult burden. Catherine closed Charlotte's bedroom door and remained in the corridor for several seconds, fighting tears before returning to William. Neither spoke about Meghan at first. They spoke about what secrecy had done to their children. Then William made a decision. He told George there was one conversation they needed to have without Charles, without advisors, without Catherine, and without anyone else in the room. The public battle could wait. Father and son were about to confront the truth privately, and that conversation would change everything. There were no courtiers in the room, no king, no Catherine to soften the edges, no private secretary to translate painful feelings into acceptable royal language. Just William and George the father, who had spent years trying to protect his child from the monarchy's hardest truths, and the son beginning to understand that one day those truths would become part of his inheritance. For the first time since Meghan's letter appeared, neither of them argued about what she had written. They talked about why her words had found such fertile ground. William spoke first. The prince told George that preparing him for kingship could never mean exposing him to every family grievance before he was ready. A private secretary, in royal life, is a senior aide who helps manage official duties and sensitive communication. But none was present now to soften what the future king needed to say. William admitted that some parts of royal history were ugly, personal, and painful. He wanted his son to understand them eventually, not be wounded by them too early. George pushed back without anger. Prince George said preparation could not consist only of ceremonies, polished explanations, and carefully selected pieces of history. If he was expected to carry responsibility one day, then he needed enough truth to understand the people behind the titles. William heard the challenge, but this time he did not treat it as defiance. William finally admitted what had really driven his anger. The prince had been frightened. Hearing George read words involving Charlotte and Louis made him feel he had failed to protect one part of their childhood from the conflict surrounding Harry and Meghan. His fury had not come from the letter alone. It came from realizing that the feud had reached his children despite every barrier he had tried to build. George admitted his own fear. He said he had considered bringing the letter privately to William, but worried it would disappear into another closed conversation and leave his questions unanswered. His father did not deny that he might have taken it away. William then gave him something more important than an explanation. The future king said George did not have to inherit his resentment toward Harry or Meghan. Those relationships belonged to William's generation. His son would eventually form his own judgment. George looked down at the letter and made his decision. He would keep it, not as evidence against Meghan, but as a reminder never to let private correspondence turn him into a weapon between adults again. William reached toward the paper, then stopped before touching it. George folded it himself. "Do you trust me?" the prince asked. "I trust you more when you tell me the difficult part," George answered. That changed everything. Father and son agreed to face the family together and establish one clear boundary before the story escaped beyond palace walls. The letter still existed, but its power had shifted, and when the outside world finally learned something had happened at Windsor, it would hear a very different story. The palace had contained the confrontation for less than a day before whispers escaped into the public arena. By morning, the private dispute had become a national spectacle. Yet the most striking detail was not another royal accusation or another angry television debate. It was the image chosen to represent the crisis: George walking beside William after the confrontation, father and son composed but visibly serious. Suddenly, Britain was no longer debating only Meghan's letter. It was debating what royal children should ever be asked to carry. The media storm accelerated immediately. Reports spread that private Sussex correspondence had been read during a royal family gathering, and Buckingham Palace refused to release the letter or confirm individual passages. Buckingham Palace, in this context, means the central royal household operation that handles official communication for the monarch. Its response was deliberately narrow. Private family correspondence would remain private. That mattered because publication could have turned a painful family dispute into permanent public evidence. A fictional morning edition of a major London newspaper captured the mood with one brutal headline: "The letter that reached the air." Beneath it appeared George walking beside William outside Windsor. The image changed the debate. Some commentators condemned the young prince for exposing private correspondence. Others argued that the greater failure was allowing a child to become involved in an adult conflict at all. William hated seeing his son transformed into the face of the crisis. The prince had spent years trying to separate George's childhood from the weight of his future role, and now that protection seemed to have collapsed overnight. George reacted differently. Prince George appeared calmer because the secret was no longer his alone. The burden had become shared, even if the attention was uncomfortable. Charles moved quickly. The king authorized one short palace statement, declaring that the younger generation must never be used as intermediaries in family disagreements. The wording mentioned nobody by name, yet everyone understood what it meant. The monarch was drawing a boundary without turning the statement into an attack on Meghan. William then made the decision that surprised even some relatives. The future king refused demands to publish the complete letter. He was furious about its effect, but he would not answer one violation of privacy by committing another. Meghan's correspondence would remain private. Outside Windsor Castle, the public mood shifted again. A small crowd fell unusually quiet as William and George emerged together. The prince briefly placed a hand on his son's shoulder before they continued walking. The world had received its headline: George no longer carried the secret alone. But the family still needed something more important than a statement. It needed a verdict on what would change from this moment forward. In the end, Meghan's fictional letter did not destroy the monarchy, remove anyone from the family, or deliver the spectacular victory either side might have imagined. Its real impact was quieter and more lasting. It forced 3 generations to confront a habit that had shaped royal life for decades. Adults protecting themselves through silence, while younger family members inherited unanswered questions. George's decision was reckless, painful, and impossible to reverse. But after the anger faded, it produced something secrecy never had: an honest conversation. Charles gathered William, Catherine, George, and Anne for one final private meeting. The king made sure there were no advisors taking notes, and no ceremonial atmosphere hanging over the room. A royal household boundary, in plain terms, meant an agreed family rule about how sensitive matters would be handled from that point forward. Charles set one immediately. Any correspondence involving the children would be shown to their parents, while younger royals would receive age-appropriate answers about family history instead of blanket silence. William turned to George before anyone else could speak. The prince told his son that reading a private letter before the entire gathering was not the choice he would ever have wanted. He also admitted something harder. George had acted because he believed every quieter path had already been closed. William could condemn the method without pretending the fear behind it was meaningless. George accepted that distinction. Prince George apologized for exposing words that had been written privately. He did not apologize for refusing to become their secret keeper. The young heir said he never wanted to carry another adult dispute alone again. William nodded and accepted the apology exactly as it was, without demanding surrender. Meghan faced no retaliation inside this dramatized account. William refused to publish the remaining correspondence, leak private passages, or launch a public counterattack. The boundary was simpler and stronger than revenge. The children would no longer receive private messages designed to pull them into unresolved adult conflicts. Meghan's words could remain part of the family history without becoming another weapon. Charles accepted his own lesson too. The monarch had spent years believing stability depended on controlling what escaped the palace. Now he understood that preserving the institution could not mean preserving silence at every cost. Anne heard the shift in his words and recognized what had changed. The goal was no longer to hide every wound, but to stop another generation inheriting them without explanation. George placed Meghan's letter inside a plain envelope and handed it to William for safekeeping. It was not evidence, it was not ammunition, it was not royal property. He simply no longer wanted to carry it himself. William took the envelope without opening it. George left the room beside his father, not behind him. Charles watched them go, and understood the final verdict. George would inherit titles, expectations, history, and enormous responsibility. But he did not have to inherit every feud unchanged. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.